Hello, everybody. Good evening. Tonight's talk is on burial traditions of the Kennebunks and cemetery iconography for all of us nerds who kind of are into that stuff. Kind of neat history of the area, and kind of going to fill it out a little bit with just burial customs as they've evolved here in Kennebunk. If you hear my dogs bark in the background, I'm just going to apologize in advance because there's no mute button for them. So let's get started here. I'm going to go to a share screen and see if I can pull up my presentation. I'm getting better at this. Oh, don't jinx myself by saying that. Hold on. All right, go here. There we go. So can everybody, well, you hopefully can see this. Let me move the screen over here just a second. Okay, so let's start off by talking about burial traditions from the time of the first European settlers that came over in the, early 1600s, late 1700s. Back then, there weren't any carved, because we were a rural community, you couldn't just go out and get yourself a nice carved headstone to put on a grave. Because we were wilderness pretty much back then, you could, if you lived in a big area like Boston or Philadelphia, you could possibly get a carved stone for your loved ones to be marked on their, where they were buried. But for the most part, you had just field stones, and they weren't carved. They were just placed, usually one at the head of the body and one at the foot of the body. And the one I'm showing you now is at an actual grave on Sea Road, Lower Sea Road down by Mother's Beach, and it is in somebody's yard. But it is a protected site because it is an ancient burial. But this one actually has been documented as the grave of a sailor that was in a shipwreck down at Mother's Beach years and years ago. And so again, they just used field stones for burials all the way up through probably the early 1700s, and even some after that. The other kind of things that you find, or I find, being the nerd that I am, are ones where someone has gone and carved the stone themselves. They'll find a great stone in their in the woods or whatever, and then they'll chip in some words of their own for the departed. The photo up on the left is the Moses Littlefield home that, when the turnpike came through, they demolished the home and left the cemetery still standing, obviously. And then years later, when I was the archivist down at the Brickstore Museum, the assistant archivist down there, I had one of the people from the DOT come in with a cart and with this stone and said, can you tell us what this is? And it turned out to be the DOT, the Maine Turnpike Authority, I should say, blew up the cemetery accidentally because they didn't realize, due to the stones and everything, that it was an actual cemetery. And this was found, and it's all that remains of Mr. Moses Littlefield, who died in 1828. This is another example of a homemade carved, not elaborate stone that is in Kennebunk up on the Whitten Hill Road. It is the only stone that I have found that that represents an African American. And I don't know if you can make it out here, so I kind of highlighted it so you can see what it says. This is the grave of Ozor, who died in 1838 at the age of 80. At that point, he would have been a freed person of color, and the place where he lived, they thought enough of him to give him a carved stone, albeit hand carved. It is very interesting. With a little bit of research, we learned that Ozor is also one of the most common surnames in Nigeria. So it's kind of a neat find. There are a couple of freed slave settlements in that area, and this is just another example of the African Americans who were living in our community at the time. So what were burials like in the colonial era? Well, they weren't fancy. There wasn't a funeral parlor. There weren't even hearses. For the most part, you were buried in a cloth that was either wrapped around you or you were put into what was called a burial robe. And there was no fancy clothing. The most fancy thing that would happen is when you had someone in your family died, you would send out notices to all of the relatives and the neighbors. And if you were a person of means, you would create mourning rings to be given as gifts to the people who attended the funeral. And this is an example of a couple of those. Another tradition was that anybody you told about the death in the family, also the females and the males, got a pair of gloves. And that was about as elaborate as things got. This picture is just kind of an example of traditions have pretty much stayed the same regarding how deep in the ground somebody would be buried. It wasn't a standard by any means. It wasn't always 6 feet. It wasn't always the height of the person, you know, or any of that stuff. The depth of the burials was really based on, is it deep enough, and this is going to sound gross, but is it deep enough to keep animals from disturbing the grave? And is it deep enough so someone won't dig it up and cart the body off, which happened later in the Victorian era when people were interested in learning body parts for medical procedures? Or is it deep enough to prevent somebody from catching a disease, smallpox, the plague, whatever? That is really the only formula they used for considering the depth of a grave. And by no means has it ever been standardized. Now you hear of 6 feet, you know, 6 feet and under, but those are the reasons for the depths. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, everyone was buried on, for the most part, were buried on their family land. They would have a family plot, you know, separate enough from the property, you know, the house, and usually with a fence or something around it. And that we still see a lot of these today. The one that you are all pretty much familiar with is the hatched cemetery that you can see on the turnpike as you're coming into up to Kennebunk. The reason these aren't someplace else is that even though you could, up until like I want to say even 1960, 70, you could move graveyards and move them to other cemeteries. But after that, they passed a law. The state of Maine passed a law in its statute 13-1101B, and it's regarding these ancient cemeteries that you can no longer, you know, just pick these up and move them. In fact, you are not allowed any longer to excavate anywhere within 25 feet of a cemetery. And a lot of that is because not everybody was buried within the cemetery enclosure. If someone, for instance, committed a murder, or, you know, for whatever kind of terrible thing that they did, they would be placed outside the walls of the cemetery, and they have, you know, or the fencing of the cemetery. And they have found in several instances when, you know, construction was done, they would find these other bodies. So they came up with the 25-foot rule so that hopefully wouldn't occur any longer. We have about 73 of these that I've located in Kennebunk and with GPS, and about 63 of them are in really horrid, rundown condition, in the weeds, in the woods, you know, lost. In fact, when everybody was using the field stones as markers for cemeteries, that's the reason why we lost a lot of the early cemeteries, because people just didn't know that's what it was. And so, you know, somebody built a house on top of it, somebody, whatever. It's kind of sad, but it's interesting to know that we've lost a good number of cemeteries, and we still have 73-ish on private grounds here in town. In the colonial era, I love these, they're so cool. in the colonial era, we started getting slate imported from England, and we had more stone carvers. And if you had means, you could send away and have a stone carved, or if somebody, you were lucky enough to have a stone carver in your town, you could have your gravestones carved. The colonial era folks, they were just preoccupied with symbolism of death. They were there to remind the living that they should be prepared to die, and it was coming pretty quick. So at this period, you see skulls and bones and some weeping willows and so forth. You also see a lot of cherubs, which were really, I think they're very sweet, winged cherubs of all different kinds in this era. The one on the stone on the left is kind of interesting in that kind of is what I call a portrait stone. It's not really a winged cherub, but it still represents a person, and I think that's kind of interesting that they would do that. That stone is actually in Newburyport, but it was an example that I wanted to be able to use. So, and the language always kind of reflects colonial times as well, because lots of times instead of saying so-and-so lies here, they would say, with it, spelled correctly, it would be L-Y-E-S instead of L-I-E-S. But again, they just wanted to warn the living that your time is coming, walk in the, good ways and all of that, because you're going to be under this stone next. This is a hand-carved stone, one corner of a hand-carved stone in Evergreen Cemetery down at the landing. And it has all the different symbols in it, even though they're getting really faint to see. You've got an hourglass representing fleeting time. You've got the scythe or sickle representing, death coming to cut your life short. You have your coffin and your bones and your skulls, and very faintly you do have a weeping willow tree here. And weeping willow trees, you'll see symbolically through all different eras of stones. They reference the weeping willow in the Bible many, many times in various different ways, and people obviously in reading the Bible brought that iconography to gravestones as well. Some say it's a tree of mourning, some say it's a tree of resurrection. It's really taken on various meanings, but this is kind of a neat local stone. So here's what a lot of these read, just to get you ready. This one says, "The living know that they must die, but all the dead forgotten lie. Their memory and their sense is gone, alike unknowing and unknown." Da, 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 da. Kind of scary stuff. This one, if I can read it, my eyes are not so great. "When this sad monument you see," yeah, maybe I can't read it. Basically, "do not wait for me, weep for yourselves, for you must die, and try the grave as well as I." Yeah, that's going to bug me that I can't. Oh, survivor. So yeah, they basically wanted to warn you that, mend your ways, walk straight and narrow, because as you can see from both of these stones, your life expectancy was a lot shorter then. I mean, for the majority of people, this fellow person died at 28, the last one at 26. The average life expectancy was, you could hope to live to 56. And if you got past that, you were called, in terms of women, you were called a relic, and all kinds of fun names. But so yeah, they were very, concerned with death and dying, and they knew it was inevitable. These are pieces of art that represent mourning in the 1820 era. They were executed mostly to record the names of someone who was buried and had died, and to, just be able to remember them in different kinds of media. Some are stitched together, some are painted, and they would hang on the walls in remembrance of those who had passed. as I said earlier, before 1840, 1850, you didn't get dressed in your best clothing to be, you weren't put in your best clothes to be buried. You were wrapped in either muslin or linen and, put into the grave that way. This is a notation from historian Andrew Walker, whose portrait hangs in the library. He had a famous diary that you can now view online thanks to the library. And this notes that his Mr. Dane was buried on Tuesday the 4th, and there was not so large a number present as was expected, his being an old prominent citizen. He was arrayed for the grave in his usual citizen's dress, pants, vest, coat, stockings, but no boots or shoes. This fashion of burying persons in their usual dress is now being introduced. Mr. Dane is the first adult buried in this village with his usual dress, with which I am acquainted. A few weeks since, Captain Hiram Noel at the port was buried in the same manner. He goes on to say that I like the fashion and I think it will become generally practiced. And as we know today, it is pretty common to have a person laid out in their street clothes for a funeral. But it's interesting that it didn't really happen here until 1850. And we've, Kennebunk being settled in 1640, that's a long time before that tradition caught on. It's kind of a horrible picture, but it's true. Embalming also wasn't something that was done until the Civil War. It just wasn't something that was invented yet. Prior to the Civil War, if you died, you were buried where you were at the time. If you had sailed overseas and you died there, for the most part, you were buried there, except for on occasion in Kennebunk. I can't remember the date, where one captain had died, and his remains were shipped home to his loved ones in a barrel on the ship. Gruesome. I wouldn't want to be able to be the one to have to plant that poor person. Urban cemeteries, the ones we think of now, like Hope Cemetery, they started out early in Boston, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn. That's because they were running out of room for building houses and so on and so forth. And it was also due to the concern over health practices of burying people in your backyard, so to speak. And so the first, park-like setting cemeteries started in those three towns in that order, actually. And that didn't actually happen because, it's Maine. That didn't really happen here until 1854. We did have the Unitarian churchyard, which was started earlier. The first interment there was in 1790, but it wasn't a garden kind of pastoral place that people wanted to go and picnic and stroll and so forth. So when Hope Cemetery was established, people were able to buy plots and lots, and they were able to put fences around them, decorate them, plant trees, and so forth. And they were actually, the big rage was if you had somebody buried out in your field, you could then have them dug up and reinterred in Hope Cemetery. So you'll see, even though it was established in 1854, you will see a lot of stones there that are a great deal older than that. And that's because families really wanted to embrace this urban setting and have the whole town be able to see where their families were buried. And so it started then. Monuments got larger and more decorative, and it was also, 1854 was also kind of the Greek revival period. So you'll see a lot of things that are indicative of the Greek revival period in terms of Greek goddesses and, beautiful statues and so forth. Here's a few examples of those. And this is Hope Cemetery here. It's quite peaceful looking. These are the neat things about this, is they've married Greek statues with anchors. Both of these have anchors, and both of these individuals buried in these were ship captains. and this was the Roman goddess of mariners. And strike me dead, I don't remember her name, but that's why these are on these tombs. And the Victorians kind of went hog wild next with their graves and their stones and their monuments. They just went all out and decorated to the hilt. This is one of the most unusual stones at Hope Cemetery. I shouldn't say that, but it is an unusual stone over at Hope Cemetery. This young man, William Shepley Parsons, died at age 15, 16 in New York City, and his body was shipped home, and he was buried at Hope. What I don't know, and I haven't been able to find any record of, is what that portrait of him is carved in. I want to say marble, but I just honestly don't know, but it is a lovely tribute. The Victorians were also kind of preoccupied with the fear of being buried alive. I probably have seen dozens of patents taken out during this era, the 1860s, the 1890s, where they were trying to build a foolproof way that if you were unfortunate enough to be buried alive, that you could simply move around enough and ring a bell at the surface of the graveyard, and the person on duty that evening would come and rescue you, depending how deep you were, I suppose. But I have never heard of anybody ever being saved by this kind of a device. And even though so many patents were created, there is a term, saved by the bell, that people do think is related to cemeteries and this mechanism, but in fact it has nothing to do with that. It's really a boxing slang term, saved by the bell on the boxing ring. But it is kind of humorous to think, that it could also apply to this contraption that, for all intensive purposes, there's no record of it ever having worked. Victorians, again, were a little bit macabre. They created all kinds of ways for mourning their dead, and one of the creepiest, although very, very common, is they would make jewelry out of the dead person's hair, and wreaths, and all sorts of crazy stuff, brooches and pins. And all of these are examples of different kinds of tributes to the dead made out of human hair. They're I think the Brickstore Museum has a couple examples of them too, but if you look at them, they're just incredibly intricate, and some of them just kind of, creepy, I guess is the best way to say. But they spent a lot of time with this, and they were tributes that would last, because, luckily in the Victorian era, they did have photography, so they would combine a lot of them with photographs as well to remember. And in some cases, they would take photos of the dead if they hadn't bothered to do photographs of the person before they passed away. And those are called post-mortem photographs. And once in a while, we'll come across those. Victorian, again, they just loved embellishments. They went over the top with their ivies and their roses and their flowers and their decorations. And luckily for Hope Cemetery, these haven't succumb to the horrible effects of acid rain, where a lot of different ones out there have. But these are just exquisite examples of Victorian art. If you were really wealthy, you would get yourself a mausoleum. This is in Hope Cemetery, this is the family mausoleum of Hartley Lord and his family. And it takes up the highest part of the cemetery, and I think it's a lot of show. You want to say you were wealthy, this is the sort of thing that you would do, and build yourself a family tomb. So now to talk about a little bit about, what do all these gravestones mean? If you ever walk through a cemetery, sometimes it's puzzling to say, well, what the heck is that? This is a tree that's supposed to represent a tree that has been cut on the right, and on the left is two trees that have been cut. The one on the left is the memorial to the Moody boys. There was 2 sons who were lost at sea, and George and his brother are buried here, and the tree represents a life cut short. So anytime you see a tree kind of thing or a column cut like this represented in a grave, it means that a life has been cut short and the individual is probably a young person. Willows, again, back to willows. We see a lot of willows. A lot of people claim different things about them. Weeping willows for mourning, again, back to biblical use of willows in the Bible. The urn is always represented in one form or another of the container of the soul. So this is kind of indicative on a lot of stones. You'll see different kinds of urns, and it's really the embodiment of the soul. The winged hourglass is pretty self-explanatory. Time is fleeting, and you better be aware of it. More Victorian beautiful stones at Hope. You'll see this a lot too. The draped urn is supposed to mean one's casting off the bodily shroud of skin and the physical form, unveiling the soul that is soon to go to heaven. And you'll see that quite a lot. And I never knew what that meant for the longest time, but it is pretty common. Again, back to the Greek revival kind of period in style, as is the giant urn over here, which I would love to see flowers in sometime, but as yet I've never seen flowers in it. We have, of course, got a lot of religious symbols in cemeteries, based on your faith. If you were Catholic, for instance, you could have a cross. If you were Jewish, there's different symbols for that. Obviously, whatever faith you were, you could put it on your gravestone if you so wanted to. The clasped hands means forever together, which I think is a nice, poignant representation. It's the wife of someone or the husband or somebody. They feel that they will always be together in eternity. The anchor, of course, is pretty easy. That's usually a mariner, a ship captain, somebody related to the sea in some way. Lots of times it means somebody who has died at sea. Wreaths. I'm just going to get my little cheat sheet here. Hold on. Yep, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay, so wreaths mean victory and eternity. And of course, the hand pointing up better than down in all cases. We have Masonic symbols came into play in the late 1800s. You've got on the far left a Masonic symbol of compass and ruler. Whenever you see 3 links of chain, that means that it's the Order of Odd Fellows, which was another fraternal organization. The heart and hand, now that, depending on where you live, could mean different things. It sometimes meant Shakers, you remember the Shaker Society, but in this context, when followed by the 3 links of chain, it was always regarding the Odd Fellow Society. Here, I don't know if you can see it very well. This is the Loyal Order of Redmen, which is another fraternal organization in the late 1800s. Lambs, usually found on little ones' graves, and morning glories and that sort of thing represent purity and obviously a very young child. And they're sweet but sad as well. You can see this one is for little Annie. Wheat means, if you see a bouquet of wheat, it usually means that that person lived a good long life. They lived a life fulfilled and lived it to its fullest. Again, more willows. This one a little more stylized, but they show up all over the place. Before I get to this slide, I'll just tell you some of the others I've learned. If you see oak leaves, they represent strength of character. Ivy represents friendship, fidelity, and immortality. Doves represent resurrection. And I think that's all. You're going to see, I mean, obviously I can't cover all of the ones that there are around the world. I mean, there's lions, there's deer, there's all sorts of things, but in Hope, these are kind of the most common symbols. Here we're moving into the 1940s, we're moving ahead, and we're definitely getting away from the ornate, we're definitely getting away from the, and I don't know if that's due to cost, I imagine it is, or the availability of precious marble. I really don't know how we came into this, what I call the boring age, although this stone is a better example of somebody who hadn't really thought, you know, enough to put their daughter's portrait on the stone. When I was in Italy, the portraits on gravestones was very, very common. And I don't see it as much here. And if I do see it, unfortunately, I see a lot of times the portrait has been stolen. So sadly enough. But this is kind of, you know, as we're stepping into the 40s and 50s, we're getting away from the embellishments, and we're getting to see a lot of more flat stones. Here's what I call modern boring stones. You know, as I said, I don't know that that's because people are afraid of vandals, or if they're, you know, just that's what's available, and the price might be just, you know, too much for them to do anything else. Some people are very creative. This is also in Hope Cemetery. This is a giant boulder. I always wonder if it was brought to Hope Cemetery or if it was just found as is and taken advantage of. But I always think this is a very unique stone, as is our next one, which is definitely a sculptural grave marker, which I also find to be, it is stone actually, but I just find that it's nice and different from all the just blocks that we see nowadays. The new so-called rage is laser drawn gravestones. You can see these throughout Kennebunk now. You know, if Dad was a fisherman, obviously that might be something that you'd like to put on his grave. I'm not a fan of these, but the jury's out for everybody else. And oddly enough, there is a well, not oddly, it's just a matter of time. They're going back to burying people in just shrouds, and sometimes with and without caskets. They are calling it green burial, and they are burying people in designated meadows, you know, no markers, you know, with the concept of going back to earth the way you came. That's becoming very popular. There's also, I just put this in here because I find it fascinating that you can also have your ashes mingled with others and pressed into a form to become a wreath for feeding fish. So there you go. If you didn't want a traditional burial, that's about as untraditional as I can think of. And getting towards the last of this here, we have the two oldest stones in Kennebunk. The one on the left is in the Unitarian churchyard, and it was put in it was the first person to be buried in the Unitarian churchyard. And when I say Unitarian churchyard, if you don't know what that is, that's the churchyard closest to the Unitarian church. And that was the first stone there. So that was 1790, and that was the widow of Joseph Storer. And I love and hate how they call her the relic of Joseph Storer, but that was a common term. And Joseph had fought and died in the Revolutionary War in Albany, and was, of course, because you couldn't ship bodies as readily and there was no embalming, he was buried in Albany. The second stone is the oldest stone in Hope Cemetery, but obviously it was moved there because Hope was started in 1854. But this is the gravestone of James Ross, and it was 1740, and it was found originally on Portland Road, you know, back in the turn of the last century, and moved to Hope Cemetery. I don't know that they found any remains to go with it, but it was moved here to Hope Cemetery. And then this one's my favorite. That's pretty simply said. There's no mystery to that iconography whatsoever. And I think it's just a cute saying, a way to mark a grave. So, and that's it on that. I'll stop sharing and we can see if there's anybody who has any questions. Okay.
Right. You should be able to unmute yourselves now.
There you go. Unmute away. There you go. Great. So any of you seen any of those kind of stones in your travels before? No? I have an addiction to cemeteries. I have to admit it. It's probably not natural, probably not good, but I definitely do. You'll probably find
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
I have about 35 relatives in Evergreen, and I just looked up some of the dates, and some of them died in 1770, but then I looked at Evergreen and it says 1876, so they must have been moved there?
Yeah, they were moved
and I'll
there.
have to check. I'll have to look at their gravestones because I'm assuming that they just got new gravestones then. I don't know. I'll have to look.
Yeah, you know, there's no really, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the records in Andrew Walker's diaries say that the remains were actually moved with the stones, and in some cases it was just the stones, as there were no remains to be found. I'll tell you kind of a funny, not so funny, quick story if you have a moment. A friend of mine lived out in Alewife, and they wanted to build a house. This was 1950. They wanted to build a house for their brother, but where they wanted to put the house was on an old graveyard. So they, you know, the family dug up the old graveyard and moved it down to adjoin another graveyard in Alewife. And so what was originally just one family, the Walker family cemetery, is now two cemeteries, but nobody knows because they were all mixed together. And my friend Nelson Wentworth told me that when he asked his uncle, well, what did the people look like when you dug up the remains? And teasingly he said, well, I don't know, I just grabbed it by the hair and shook it like this, and that's all that was left. And I'd say, kind of horrible, but they could do that then. They cannot do that now. They cannot move anybody who is in a cemetery any longer, and that's maybe part of it, because who knows what we've lost. Any other questions? What about dead doves draped over the top of a stone? Again, doves and so forth they mean resurrection. A life has passed and there's hope of resurrection. There's a lot of dove symbols in gravestones, but it mostly is hope of eternity and resurrection. And I think that might be it. I'll turn it over to Allison.
All right, thank you very much. This will be up on our YouTube channel in a few days if you're interested in referring it to anybody else or watching it again. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kathy.
Bye, guys.